Let's start with what we can confirm. When law enforcement describes a victim as targeted, it introduces multiple possibilities. The first is that Nancy herself was the focus, that someone had a grievance, a motive, or a connection to her directly. The second is that Nancy was selected not for who she was, but for who she represents. And that distinction is critical. If you're following this investigation with us here at Apex Crime Analyst, make sure you're subscribed, because this case is entering a phase where expert analysis may matter more than public evidence. Over 90 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson area home, law enforcement publicly states they are definitely closer to solving the case. But sources close to the investigation tell a different story, one of exhausted leads and mounting frustration. If evidence exists that brings investigators closer to answers, why has no arrest been made? And if the case has stalled, what does closer actually mean? To understand why, we need to examine the evidence of planning. Approximately 20 days before Nancy's disappearance, a suspicious vehicle was reported in the area near her home. Law enforcement later specifically requested surveillance footage from that date, suggesting they believed the vehicle's presence was significant. Then, on the night Nancy vanished, a masked figure was captured on camera tampering with her doorbell system. And minutes after the abduction is believed to have occurred, a vehicle was seen speeding on a road approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home. This is not the behavior of an impulsive offender. This is reconnaissance, execution, and escape. According to retired FBI profiler Jim Fitzgerald, this pattern suggests an organized offender who studied the location beforehand, understood the technical systems in place, and had a planned route of egress. But it still doesn't answer the central question: why Nancy Guthrie? Nancy Guthrie's daughter is Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism. Savannah has co-anchored NBC's Today Show for over a decade. She has appeared in millions of homes. She has conducted high-profile interviews, and she has, by necessity of that public role, been accessible to the public in a way most people are not. That accessibility comes with risk, and according to multiple retired FBI profilers who have reviewed this case, the Savannah connection may not be coincidental, it may be causal. Jim Fitzgerald, a retired FBI profiler and forensic linguist who worked on the Unabomber case, stated in a recent interview, "I can't help but think this somehow involves Savannah Guthrie. Not that she did anything wrong, but something to do with her profession, something to do with someone who she's been in touch with over the years." Ray Carr, also a retired FBI profiler, expanded on this theory. If we go with the ideology that it was based upon Savannah, then we have to go even further back and say that this thing didn't start one morning. It started out much simpler, much less dangerous. It was more of a stalking type of thing. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition based on institutional knowledge built from interviewing over 1,500 serial offenders. And the pattern they see here is stalking escalation. Let's examine how stalking cases typically progress. According to FBI behavioral analysis, obsession with a public figure often follows a predictable arc. It begins with observation, watching from a distance, consuming media appearances, developing what the offender perceives as a relationship. Then comes attempted contact letters, emails, social media messages. When those attempts are ignored or blocked, frustration builds. The offender escalates. They try to find physical proximity. They may appear at public events. They may attempt to bypass security. And when all direct access fails, some offenders redirect. They cannot reach the primary target, so they find a proxy, someone close to that person, someone more accessible, someone whose suffering will impact the primary target. Jim Fitzgerald described this dynamic explicitly. His original goal would have been Savannah Guthrie herself. He couldn't get to Savannah, she's too well protected. So what's the next best thing? The mother. This theory has investigative implications that are difficult to overstate. If correct, it means the answer to Nancy's disappearance may not be found in Nancy's life at all. It may be found in Savannah's public history, specifically in communications Savannah has received over the past 5 to 10 years. Fitzgerald's recommendation to investigators was direct. Every single email ever sent to Savannah, go back at least 5 years, find out who sent it, and see what they were doing on February 1st. But we need to be clear about what is confirmed and what is interpretation. Law enforcement has not publicly stated that Savannah is connected to the motive. Sheriff Nanos has said he has a theory about why this happened, but he has not disclosed what that theory is. The stalking escalation model fits the available evidence, but so do other explanations. What we can confirm is this: Nancy was targeted. The crime was planned. The offender had knowledge of the location and security systems, and the offender has not been identified. What we cannot confirm is motive, and that gap between what investigators know and what they're willing to say is where this case currently lives. After Nancy's disappearance, ransom demands were reportedly received. The payment method requested was Bitcoin, an anonymized cryptocurrency. No proof of life was provided publicly, and no negotiation process has been disclosed. For investigators, ransom communications are typically rich sources of information. Linguistic analysis can reveal education level, regional language patterns, and psychological state. Demands themselves reveal motive, or they should. But according to Jim Fitzgerald, something about these ransom demands doesn't fit the standard kidnapping model. "I never was convinced the ransom request was real," Fitzgerald stated. "I think it was opportunists taking advantage of a situation. If this was a true kidnapping, they would have left some kind of communication on the site that night." His logic is straightforward. In genuine ransom kidnappings, the offender establishes communication immediately. They provide proof of life. They create a channel for negotiation. The goal is payment, so every action is designed to facilitate that transaction. In this case, the ransom communication was delayed. It used an anonymized method, and, critically, it came after the case had already received national media attention due to Savannah's prominence. This raises a difficult question. If the ransom is not legitimate, what does that tell us about Nancy's fate? Because if the primary motive was not financial, if it was psychological, need-driven, or symbolic, then the likelihood that Nancy is still alive decreases significantly. Let's return to the physical evidence, because this is where investigative certainty lies. We know there was blood on Nancy's front porch. We know that mixed DNA was recovered. We know a masked individual was captured on surveillance. And we know law enforcement has processed what they describe as a substantial volume of evidence. But here's what we also know. No arrest has been made. 89 days have passed. And the investigation, according to at least one source, has reached a point where they are even calling back psychics. That statement, if accurate, suggests desperation. It suggests leads have been exhausted. It suggests that whatever evidence exists, it has not been sufficient to identify or apprehend a suspect. Yet Sheriff Nanos continues to state publicly that investigators are definitely closer. He has said they believe they understand the motive. He has warned that the suspect could strike again. And he has confirmed that Nancy's family members, including Savannah, have been ruled out as suspects. So we are left with a contradiction. Either the investigation has made significant progress that remains invisible to outside observers, or the public statements are designed to maintain confidence in a case that has functionally stalled. Jim Clemente, another retired FBI profiler, offered a perspective on this. "There is so much we're not privy to that the FBI knows. They won't release it until this thing is solved." He emphasized that evidence compartmentalization is standard practice, and that outside observers rarely have access to the most critical elements of an investigation. But even Clemente acknowledged that 89 days without an arrest is substantial. And in cases like this, time is not always an ally. One of the most unusual aspects of this case is what hasn't happened. The offender has not communicated. There has been no manifesto, no explanation, no public statement of motive. And for a crime that appears to be psychologically motivated rather than financially driven, that silence is striking. Jim Fitzgerald addressed this directly in a public appeal to the offender. He stated, "I challenge the abductor to stay anonymous as much as you want, but give us a reason behind this. Otherwise, you're just a screwed-up guy with some kind of deep-rooted perversions about older women." That appeal was strategic. It was designed to provoke the offender's ego, to make silence psychologically uncomfortable. Because according to FBI behavioral analysis, most need-driven offenders want recognition. They want their story told. They want to be understood. The Unabomber wrote a 35,000-word manifesto. BTK taunted police with letters. Even offenders who remain anonymous often find ways to communicate their reasoning. But in this case, if we exclude the ransom demands that experts believe are likely fake, there has been no communication at all. That raises several possibilities. The first is that the offender is satisfied that whatever psychological need drove this crime has been met. and there is no further compulsion to act or explain. The second is that something went wrong. Jim Fitzgerald suggested this explicitly. Maybe she died right away or within hours. Maybe it didn't go well. The third possibility is that the offender is unable to communicate, either because they are incapacitated, deceased, or in custody for an unrelated offense. And the fourth possibility is that they are simply disciplined, that they understand communication creates risk, and they are willing to live with anonymity rather than exposure. This is the kind of case where expert analysis becomes essential, because the answers are not visible on the surface. If you're finding value in this breakdown, make sure you're subscribed to Apex Crime Analyst. We're tracking this investigation as it develops, and there are aspects of this case that are only now beginning to surface. Let's turn our attention to the vehicle sightings, because this is where the investigation may have its strongest lead. We have confirmed reports of suspicious vehicles at 3 distinct points in time. First, approximately 20 days before Nancy's disappearance, a vehicle was reported near her home. Law enforcement later specifically requested surveillance footage from this date, which suggests they believe this was reconnaissance that the offender was studying the location in advance. Second, on the night of the abduction, a vehicle was present in the area. The details of this sighting have not been made public, but it appears in the investigative timeline. Third, and perhaps most significant, a vehicle was captured on surveillance, speeding away from an area approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home. The timing of this sighting aligns with the window immediately after Nancy is believed to have been taken. And critically, this footage fell outside the original time window investigators had requested from the public. It was discovered later, during an expanded review. That expansion is important. It tells us investigators widened their search parameters, either because initial footage was insufficient or because they identified a pattern that required a broader analysis. If the same vehicle appears in multiple sightings, it becomes more than a piece of background information. It becomes a connective thread, evidence of planning, execution, and escape. And if that vehicle can be identified, if a license plate can be enhanced, or a make and model can be determined with certainty, it could provide the investigative breakthrough this case needs. According to available reporting, investigators have examined multiple vehicles, including one belonging to a family member. That family member has been ruled out as a suspect, which suggests the examination was part of an elimination process rather than focused suspicion. But the broader vehicle analysis continues, and that tells us law enforcement believes the answer may still be sitting in surveillance footage that has not yet been fully processed. Sheriff Nanos has stated he has a theory about the motive. He has not disclosed what that theory is, and that withholding creates a challenge for independent analysis. If the motive is personal, a grudge against Nancy herself, then the suspect pool is likely small, and the investigation should be focused on individuals with direct connections to her life. But there is no public indication that Nancy had conflicts, enemies, or circumstances that would make her a target for violence. If the motive is symbolic, Nancy, as a representation of something the offender opposes or resents, then the suspect pool expands significantly, and the investigation becomes more difficult. And if the motive is proxy-based Nancy as a way to impact, punish, or contact Savannah, then the suspect pool shifts entirely. It moves away from Nancy's personal sphere and into Savannah's public one. It moves into the realm of parasocial obsession, where someone who has never met Savannah may nonetheless feel a profound connection to her. That third explanation is the one multiple FBI profilers have converged on. Not because it is confirmed, but because it fits the pattern of behavior they have seen in other cases. And because the alternative explanations, financial motive, random predation, personal grudge do not align as cleanly with the evidence of planning and targeting. But until law enforcement confirms or denies this theory, it remains exactly that, a theory. If the stalking theory is correct, then this crime did not begin on January 31st. It began years earlier, in the form of communications, obsessive attention, and escalating frustration. Jim Fitzgerald has recommended that investigators go back at least 5 years in reviewing communications sent to Savannah. That recommendation is based on historical cases where offenders harbored grievances or obsessions for extended periods before acting. He cited one example explicitly, a case where the offender held a grudge for 25 years before committing violence. The point is that the first visible action is not the first contact. Long before someone crosses the threshold into abduction or violence, they have typically left a trail: letters, emails, social media messages, appearances at public events. NBC, like most major media organizations, likely maintains security files on threats and concerning communications directed at on-air talent. If those files exist for Savannah, they may contain the answer. They may show a pattern of increasing intensity. They may reveal mentions of family members. They may include references to Tucson or Arizona. And they may show a shift in tone or behavior in late January 2026 that could explain the timing. But this approach requires massive investigative resources. It requires reviewing potentially thousands of communications. It requires cross-referencing names, identifying patterns, and then determining the whereabouts and activities of specific individuals on February 1st. Whether that work is currently being done is unknown. Law enforcement has not publicly discussed this avenue of investigation. But according to the profilers we've consulted, if it's not happening, it should be. One detail that has not received sufficient attention is the level of technical preparation evident in this crime. The offender tampered with Nancy's doorbell camera. Internet disruptions were reported in the area during the abduction window, and the offender succeeded in removing Nancy from her home without triggering a prolonged alarm or response. That level of preparation suggests several things. First, the offender had studied the security systems in place. Second, they understood how to disable or interfere with those systems. And third, they had the capability to do so. This is not the profile of a disorganized, impulsive offender. This is someone with either technical expertise or the time and resources to acquire it. And that detail could be useful in narrowing the suspect pool. If investigators are examining communications to Savannah, they should be looking not just for tone and obsession, but for indicators of technical capability. Does the sender demonstrate knowledge of security systems? Do they mention surveillance, internet protocols, or electronic countermeasures? Do they describe themselves in ways that suggest relevant expertise? These details, if present, could provide corroboration that connects a historical communication to the technical execution of this crime. At 89 days, this case occupies an uncomfortable space. It is too early to be declared cold, but too late to be considered actively breaking. 30,000 tips were reportedly received in the initial weeks. Those tips are still being processed, but according to at least one source, the investigation has reached a point of diminishing returns. The contradiction between official optimism and source-reported frustration is difficult to reconcile. Either law enforcement is strategically withholding information to protect a developing case, or they are managing public perception in the absence of concrete progress. Jim Clementi's perspective is that compartmentalization explains the gap, that the FBI, which is almost certainly involved given the profile of the case, holds information that local sources do not have access to, and that the discipline required to protect an investigation often means appearing less certain publicly than you are internally. But 89 days is also long enough that if a suspect had been clearly identified, we would typically expect movement toward arrest, even if charges have not yet been filed. The fact that no one has been named, no one has been detained, and no visible investigative action has been disclosed suggests that either the evidence is insufficient or the suspect remains genuinely unknown. So here is where we are. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 89 days. Law enforcement believes she was targeted. They believe they understand the motive, but they will not disclose it. They state they are closer to resolution, but no suspect has been named. Physical evidence exists: blood, DNA, surveillance, but it has not led to an arrest. Multiple FBI profilers believe the answer lies in Savannah's history of public contact, that this crime was proxy-motivated, and that the offender is likely someone who has been fixated on Savannah for years. But that theory, while compelling, remains unconfirmed by law enforcement. And so, the real question is not what happened to Nancy Guthrie. The evidence strongly suggests she was abducted violently, likely by someone who planned the crime in advance. The real question is, who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to do this? And why, after 89 days of investigation, has that person not been identified? There are several pathways to resolution. The first is forensic. If the mixed DNA collected at the scene can be matched to a known individual, either through database comparison or investigative identification and subsequent sample collection, it could provide the link investigators need. The second is digital. If the internet disruptions can be traced to a specific device or location, or if surveillance footage can be enhanced to provide a clearer identification of the vehicle or the masked individual, it could narrow the suspect pool significantly. The third is communicative. If the offender contacts law enforcement, media, or Savannah herself either to explain, to taunt, or to satisfy an ego-driven need for recognition, it could provide both motive clarification and investigative direction. The fourth is historical. If investigators identify a pattern of escalating communications to Savannah that aligns with the timing and targeting of this crime, it could provide both suspect identification and evidentiary foundation for prosecution. And the fifth is incidental. Sometimes cases break not through direct investigation, but through unrelated events, an offender arrested for another crime, a witness coming forward belatedly, a piece of evidence reprocessed with new technology. But none of these pathways are guaranteed. And 89 days in, the investigative reality is that Nancy's whereabouts remain unknown, her condition remains unknown, and the person responsible remains unnamed. This is not a case where the answers are obvious. It is not a case where evidence points cleanly in one direction. It is a case built on contradictions between official statements and source reports, between expert theory and investigative confirmation, between the appearance of progress and the reality of unresolved questions. What we know is that Nancy Guthrie was targeted. What we suspect is that the motive may be connected to her daughter's public prominence. What we do not know is whether law enforcement is close to identifying the person responsible or whether this case is entering a phase where resolution becomes increasingly uncertain. If you've been following this investigation with Apex Crime Analyst, stay with us, because this case is not over. And sometimes, the most important developments are the ones that happen quietly, behind the scenes, in the methodical work of investigators who refuse to give up. If you want to continue tracking this case as it develops, subscribe now. And if you have information that could assist this investigation, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Because 89 days is a long time to wait for answers. And for Nancy's family, every day without resolution is another day in the worst kind of uncertainty.